I was listening to an early, this is an early recording, and you were trying to find your voice, I feel, and you almost sounded more like Robert Plant than the guy you sound like today. Am I correct?
Boy, I listen back to those vocals and go, who is that? Yeah, who is that? Who is she? I mean, some of his high screaming stuff, it's like, wow. And whether my balls hadn't dropped completely by then, or I don't know, but...
Well, it was just interesting to hear you singing on the first 3 records, and then at some point it's like, there's the voice.
Yeah.
His
balls dropped. Wow. Or at least one of them did. One of the 3. Gosh. All right. Hockey fans, San Jose Sharks. We go to the Shark Tank and watch the Sharks play. Seek and Destroy is their skating out music. And I can't believe, it's like, are you kidding me? This is horrible. This sounds terrible. Get a remixed version. Come on.
You should just give it to him. Show up and give it to him.
It's this little kid, man.
When did you start
singing?
Well, no.
Finally.
No. I kind of hear it. It's like the 4th album, right?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Where do you consider it happening?
I think the Black Album. I don't know. It's all singing. It's all me, and it's exactly where I was. And that's as good as I could do back then, and this is as good as I can do now, and who knows.
If you listen to Master of Puppets and then you compare it to the Black Album, you may have noticed that the tone of James Hetfield's voice is quite different between those 2 albums. On Master of Puppets, the kind of distortion in his voice is a lot more subtle. You almost don't even hear it. It's more that it just adds to the bite of the delivery. But then on the Black Album, it's much more of a prominent edge to his singing, and it's really become his signature style that we think of today. When we try to think of what James Hetfield style singing really sounds like, usually we're thinking about the Black Album rather than his sound on Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning. Especially on Ride the Lightning, it seemed like he was to some extent influenced by hair metal vocalists, as he had a much more kind of mixed voice sound with more subtle distortion and kind of more of a pharyngeal based mix.
I'm going to play a little of this. Tell me what comes to mind.
Yeah.
You don't go up
His
high
balls
like that
haven't
anymore.
dropped yet.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
So what really happened between Master of Puppets and the Black Album that explains why his sound quality changed so much? Well, of course we don't know the motivations, but the biggest change that I hear is the way that he placed the distortion in his voice. I recorded a couple of demos to show kind of an imitation of it, and of course I won't sound exactly like James Hetfield, but hopefully you can get a feel for the technique difference between the 2. So here is kind of the style that I picked up when hearing Master of Puppets.
End of fashion play, crumbling away.
And then on the Black Album, it kind of felt like his style shifted to more like this.
Exit light, enter night.
Just for an even easier comparison, this would be a Master of Puppets song, but kind of using the technique that he seemed to use on the Black Album.
End of fashion play, crumbling away.
And then here's a Black Album song, but with more of the Master of Puppets style technique.
Exit light, enter night.
So really the key difference between these recordings is that the Master of Puppets style singing is more of a pharyngeal distortion, and then the Black Album singing is more of a false chord kind of throat-based distortion. So the difference between those two is that you find the false chord-based distortion as kind of a rumbling in your lower throat. You kind of start as like an angry sigh, and then you kind of bring it up. And then by kind of taking the rumbling from the sigh up, you kind of get that throat distortion. The distortion on Master of Puppets, though, is really kind of like what someone like Axl Rose would use, although he does it in a more extreme way. To find that, you start on a mixed voice note, and then you try to kind of compress to almost like squeeze it a little bit, not too much, but just enough to get it to break up a bit. And then to get the Metallica sound, of course, you're bringing it down into your mid-range instead of using it in your high range like Axl Rose would. So I have some recordings right here to kind of show how you would find the progression for how you would find the more lower, like rumbling distortion that we saw on the Black Album. Here's kind of the progression for that. To get the Black Album type distortion, you kind of start with an angry sigh, like a and then you kind of bring it up in front of you, like and that'll get you kind of at that note. But to get it into the range, which is a bit higher, you kind of have to use your core muscles, like you have to use those, like when you go that'll help you get it higher. So once you have the try to do that while kind of tensing your abs, like and that'll get you the exit, like that, and that's how you find it. And then if you're trying to find the distortion that was used more on Master of Puppets, here's kind of how you can find that with an example that I did. To find the more Master of Puppets style distortion, you kind of need to find your mixed voice first. Like you need to be able to go like, oh, which James Hetfield actually could do. If you look at some of his clips from really early, he did kind of have that mixed voice. So once you have the, oh, you kind of tense up, you kind of push it just a little bit more like this, like, hey, 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 hey. And then you kind of bring it down more into your mid-range, like, hey,
And a fashion play.
like that. I do want to make a note that actually, whether it's the Black Album or Master of Puppets, he kind of uses both techniques a little bit. Like he's kind of in between both of them, so he's not entirely the throat distortion or entirely the Master of Puppets kind of. Like even in like Black Album songs, you'll hear a bit of that kind of more Master of Puppets style. It's just that he more gravitated towards one of them on Master of Puppets and more gravitated towards the other one on the Black Album. So the point of this is I want you to understand both techniques because they both have their place. And as James Hetfield kind of decided his identity as a singer, it seems like he gravitated more towards one of the styles. And I think that when he did so, that style of singing was pretty new and unique, and it was a great sound for him. As for the pros and cons of each one, I find that the more like James Hetfield Black Album style is kind of more noticeable. So when you're doing it, it needs to be in the right kind of music or else it can kind of sound out of place. It sounds much more like you're deliberately adding distortion and it needs to really fit. So if you just kind of throw it in here and there without it necessarily being right for the song, it can kind of sound out of place. Whereas the more Master of Puppets style, like the pharyngeal distortion, that one is more subtle and you can kind of just throw it in random places and it just sounds less out of place. But on the other hand, if you want something that's just like way more like aggressive and kind of like noticeable and powerful, like something that really gets people's attention, the lower Black Album kind of distortion can really be good for that. Like especially if you want something to be like a really dramatic, like aggressive kind of moment in a song, it really hits a little bit harder and you don't have as much of a whiny sound if that's something that you're not trying to have. But one other advantage of the Master of Puppets style distortion is that it is a lot easier to blend into clean singing. So here I recorded an example of how you can kind of seamlessly go back and forth between clean and the more pharyngeal type of distortion.
This is a clean note, and then I'm gonna give it some more distortion.
So you can see they're kind of both using the same bass technique, and then really the only difference is you're leaning into it a bit more to get it to break up. Whereas to switch to, especially on higher notes, to switch to like the Black Album more lower down, gruff kind of distortion, you really have to almost switch modes. So it can be harder to seamlessly connect with your clean singing. So if you're going back and forth a lot, the type that he used on Master of Puppets might be a better fit. So hopefully that was helpful. Let me know what you thought. And I hope you use both of those in your projects and your singing. So take care and have a good day.